Joining me now, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Dr. Alan Greenspan. Dr. Greenspan, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure being with you, Jake.
I know that you agree with Dr. Summers that job growth will continue to accelerate. Do you think it will accelerate enough that it will make a dent in unemployment? That is, that we see the numbers of 300,000 jobs created a month as opposed to just 100,000, which basically is treading water?
I'm not sure, but I don't think it's impossible by any means. There is a momentum building up, which is really just beginning, and it's got a way to go. There are certain critical issues here. First, we have to remember that the capital gains on 401ks are $600 billion. And as we saw when money was being evaporated in those particular accounts, people pulled back their consumption. They're now moving forward in a more positive direction. Secondly, capital investment, which had been extremely depressed, is still depressed for real estate, but equipment is coming back in a fairly substantial way. But most important of all is this incredible increase in the difficulties, I should put it this way, the increase in the lead times that it takes purchasing managers to get new materials for inventories. What that necessarily means is that they're going to have to build inventories to protect their production lines at an ever-increasing pace. And that is a self-reinforcing cycle. So I think the particular area of the economy which people are not putting enough, enough focus on is how significant this rebound of inventories is going to be after such an extraordinarily dramatic decline that occurred through all of last year. Remember, as of now, inventory change is zero. The level of inventories is at the absolutely low level. And all of the people who are in the business to see what the tightness of markets are saying effectively that there's a shortage of inventories out there, and we're on the edge of a significant buildup.
As you mentioned real estate, and I've heard a lot of economists talk about their fear of the commercial real estate bubble popping. How concerned are you by that?
Well, I think it's already popped in a sense. I mean, real estate prices generally are down almost 50%. And they've come back a little bit very recently.
The kind of crisis that we saw with the subprime housing and personal housing.
Yeah, with prices already down and adjusted, if we were going to get severe secondary reactions, they would have likely occurred, and they would have occurred if it weren't for the fact that the rest of the economy is showing some degree of buoyancy.
Now, Dr. Summers didn't really answer the question, but I was wondering your thoughts on whether or not we can expect, if there is accelerated job growth, whether or not you think there will be any dips in that, including into negative job growth, or if you think it's just going to be a straight line.
You mean a month by month increases?
Yeah, month by month.
I suspect it's month by month. I mean, a statistical aberration possibly, but the momentum is very clearly there, and I doubt very much that we're going to run out of that momentum until very late in the year.
So no double dip recession?
I think the odds of that have fallen very significantly in the last 2 months.
The president signed massive health care reform legislation into law a few weeks ago. You have expressed concern about the legislation as it was making its way through the process, about whether or not it did enough to contain costs. What did you think about the final legislation? Does it contain costs enough?
Well, the CBO, incidentally, Congressional Budget Office, which is really a first-rate operation, says that it does. The problem is not their estimates, but the range of potential error in those estimates. And when you're dealing with an economy in which federal debt is becoming ever increasingly a problem, it strikes me that when you're dealing with public policy and you're in a position where you have to ask yourself, what happens if we are wrong? In other words, in the case now where our buffer between our capacity to borrow and our actual debt is narrowing for the first time, I think, in American history. There's the question, supposing we are wrong on the cost estimates, and indeed they are actually much higher than the best estimates can generate, the consequences are very severe. Whereas if they are too high, it's very easy to adjust. So I think there's an issue over and above the question of what's the best cost estimate. There's a policy strategy here which I think requires us to lean in an ever more conservative area with respect to judging these
It might have been too rosy, the projections, you're saying.
Possibly. I don't know that. But I do know that the probability that it might be is much higher than we would like.
You have said recently that if institutions are too big to fail, they're too big. Do you support the Volcker rule, which would limit some of the transactions that commercial banks can do?
Well, I think the point that he is making, that deposit funds which are subsidized should not be employed for speculative purposes, I would agree with. The problem basically with the Volcker rule is it's very difficult to apply in a general way, and I think that's why there's been considerable resistance to it. Not the principle, but the issue of being able to segregate the types of transactions which are helping customers and those which are strictly proprietary. Until they do that, I think it's very difficult to implement.
You'll be testifying about the financial crisis on Wednesday before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. When you testified before Congress in October, you said that you finally saw a flaw in the way that you looked at markets, that markets cannot necessarily be trusted to completely police themselves. But isn't it more than a flaw? Isn't it an indictment of Ayn Rand and the view that laissez-faire capitalism can be expected to function properly, that markets can be trusted to police themselves?
Not at all. I think that there is no alternative if you want to have economic growth and higher standards of living in a democratic society to have competitive markets. And indeed, if you merely look at the history since the Enlightenment of the 18th century, when all of those ideas surfaced and became applicable in public policy, we've had an explosion of economic growth, and especially in the developing countries where hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty, of extreme poverty and starvation, basically because we have competitive markets. So it's not the principle of competitive markets, which really has no alternative, which works. It is a strict application, as I presented in a Brookings paper fairly recently in a somewhat technical area. The major mistake was assuming what the nature of risks would be. And the reason it was missed is we had no experience of the type of risks that arose following the default of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. That's the critical mistake, and I made it. Everybody that I know who works in this business made it. And it means that basically we have to work our way back to understanding what went on. And as I argue, what we need is far more required capital for financial institutions than we've had.
There's, as you know, Michael Burry, who is a hedge fund manager in California, who made a lot of money looking at the subprime mortgage situation in the previous years and saying to himself, this is crazy, it can't continue, and he bet against it and made a lot of money. You were asked about it last month, and you referred to him as a statistical illusion. He has an op-ed in today's New York Times in which he questions whether or not you should be taking him more seriously, and he says Mr. Greenspan should use his substantial intellect and unsurpassed knowledge of government to ascertain and explain exactly how he and other officials missed the boat. If the mistakes were properly outlined, that might both inform Congress's efforts to improve financial regulation and help keep future Fed chairmen from making the same errors again. Why are you not more interested in hearing what he has to say?
Well, on the contrary. First of all, I was not referring to him specifically. There are three groups of people. Those who got it wrong about what the complexity was about to emerge, that's the vast majority of people,
right,
myself included. Then there's a group, a relatively small but not negligible group, who got it surely by luck. And then there's a very small group, most of whom are my friends, who got it right for the right reasons and have done it time and time again. I don't know Mr. Burrow, but he basically may very well be in that third group. I don't know that. But the problem is he, in that article, which I read quickly this morning, is actually making the case that it's a very small group because he says effectively that no one agreed with him. Well, he made his money properly, in my judgment, and I think very successfully, by effectively selling subprimes short. Now, if nobody...
He was betting against subprime mortgages working.
Exactly. And if everybody agreed with him, or a large proportion of people agreed with him, he wouldn't have been able to sell those contracts, the short contracts, so to speak, which works their way through credit default swaps and technical jargon. There'd be nobody to buy it because they would agree with him. So it required a very large proportion of the investing public, sophisticated investing public, to disagree with him. And I think, I don't know whether or not he is in that extremely small group, which may in fact be really exceptionally adroit at these things. As I said a minute ago, I know 4 or 5 people who are really good. I don't know 6, 7, 8, or 9.
All right, Dr. Alan Greenspan, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us today.